Hello, everyone. And it really is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Marder to our virtual platform. Thank you also to you, our guests, who responded with such alacrity to our invitation to attend Michael's talk today, which is titled Wastelands, Wastewaters, Waste Air, Waste Fire, the vastness of devastation. A weighty subject indeed, and one we strive to counterbalance with activism and hope. So my name is Brenton Mart, and I'm the curator of Bio, Art and Design Africa, which is a research program we initiated at the VIAD Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. BARDA, as the strand is known, is dedicated to research into how, into how the biological arts might be used as a form of decolonial activism within a continent that continues to bear the brunt of insidious abuses. To do this, we curate exhibitions, we publish catalogs and special editions of journals, we host colloquia, seminars, and other forms of scholarly engagement. We've initiated an incredible international program of artists in residence. And finally, we host more popular forms of public engagement within the live and also in the virtual spheres. Professor Michael Marder has recently joined our team as a senior research associate. And this talk is the first of what I hope is an ongoing, fruitful, and productive exchange between Michael and our BARDA team. So Michael, it really is a significant honor to have you with us here. And thank you again for being here to share your thoughts with us today. I will now hand over to my colleague, Keisha Jacobs, who will facilitate the proceedings from here on. So Keisha, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brenton. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for your virtual attendance. I am Keisha Jacobs, your facilitator for this webinar with Michael Marder, Ikerbasque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country and Senior Research Associate in the VIAD Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Michael is a philosopher and prolific author whose recent books include Eco-Freud and Metamorphosis Reimagined, both published in 2025, and Fiori di Fioco, co-authored with Anais Tander and published in 2025. In 2024, Michael wrote Plants in Place, a Phenomenology of the Vegetal, co-authored with Edward S. Casey. And in 2023, he wrote The Phoenix Complex, a Philosophy of Nature and Time as a Plant. Michael's research interests include ethical and political philosophy, phenomenology, political theory, ecological thought, and environmental philosophy. Given his impressive academic background, Michael is the recipient of numerous prestigious residencies and fellowships, including the Senior Fellowship received from the Institute for Global Reconstitution in 2025, and the Leonardo Olatz Molina Residency, awarded in 2019. Michael's talk this evening, as mentioned by Brenton, is titled Wastelands, Wastewaters, Waste Air, Waste Fire, the Vastness of Devastation. In this talk, Michael examines unwasting waste as the defining paradox of the Anthropocene, in which waste no longer decomposes but endures, severed from cycles of use, decay, and renewal. This persistence, material, psychic, and metaphysical, reveals the ontology of waste as both empty and overfull, absent and excessively present. Drawing on The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot alongside Aristotle, Freud, and Goethe. Marder discusses how waste infiltrates the elemental orders of earth, water, air, and fire, dissolving distinctions and temporal rhythms of metabolism. In its pure form, waste becomes an indigestible remainder, detached from economy and ecology, yet constitutive of the world it deconstitutes. Marder argues that the anthropos of the Anthropocene is defined by this condition, the creation of residues that cannot waste away, and that within this devastation lies a paradoxical potential for a new commons emerging from the very vastness that desolates. Michael's talk draws from his book, Dumb Philosophy, a Phenomenology of Devastation, published in 2020. Michael has also written chapters related to dump philosophy, which include The Task of Thinking in the Age of Dumping, published in What Matters Most, Conversations on the Art of Living, 2023, and This Dump That Is the Anthropocene, published in Metabolic Riffs, 2019. We have invited Michael to present his talk this evening as part of VIAD's ongoing interest in the urgent ecological, political, and aesthetic questions through the transformation of waste and wreckage into sites of resistance and rewilding. The most recent example of this interest is displayed throughout the group exhibition Refusability, curated by Brenton Mott and Professor Leora Faber, exhibited earlier this year at the Farder Gallery in Johannesburg. Right, before I hand over to Michael, please note that at the end of this presentation, we will be accepting questions from the audience. These could be asked live, so please feel free to ask your questions live, or you can pop your questions in the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen. It is now my absolute honor to welcome Professor Michael Marder. Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much, Keisha, for this introduction, and thank you, Brent, and also for your words. I'm really grateful to VIAD and the University of Johannesburg for making this event possible and for inviting me to share what are the most recent thoughts on the ongoing condition that in 2020, I called the global dump or the ontological dump. So this reflection on waste as a philosophical concept is a kind of an outgrowth of an earlier project, but not necessarily included in it. So this is really quite experimental and fresh, and I'm looking forward to sharing with all of you in attendance. So if we are to express the sense or the nonsense of the dump that the world has become or is in the process of becoming, then we could translate it into unwasting waste, unwasting waste, right? This is something that we'll have an occasion to reflect on as an expression, as a reality, really, in the next few minutes. Waste proliferates and endures, gaining independence from the processes that produced it and that may take it up again. It clogs organisms and ecosystems, minds and bodies. It is at once stable in its persistence and dynamic in its accretion. It maintains its material identity, its molecular or ideational makeup that is neither catabolized nor anabolized. That is, the two main movements of metabolism are paused in it. In the psyche, it is memory without forgetting, or worse, without remembering that one remembers. So it does not do this unwasting waste, does not do what waste is supposed to do, refusing to waste away. In unwasting waste, the verbal sense separates from the substantive one. The activity or the passivity of undergoing changes comes to a halt, which is why the stuff that it is remains. A problem, if not the problem, of our century is neither waste itself nor its snowballing volumes, but this very split that I'm trying to diagnose here between the verbal and the substantive dimensions of sense, not only of waste, and of its repercussions, right? So waste remains, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, which is wasting away. Unwasting waste is pure waste. Taken literally, pure waste is an oxymoron, of course, seeing that waste is typically associated with impurities, with dirt, with something soiled. Conceptually, it signals what in the accounting systems of production and consumption, as much as of being itself, is written off as an absolute loss, wasted, useless, non-utilizable. And I must mention here, of course, that waste is one of the most economic terms for garbage dump or whatever the classification of refuse you want to come up with, right? Appearing under the aegis of negativity and absence, pure waste nevertheless lays claim to the present and to presence, the lingering and growing presence of residues that impact life and the living in an ever more intrusive manner, from the outside but also from within, from inside. When it is transformed into pure loss, waste sheds its economic and ecological trappings, despite the fact that it is the most economic term, as I've already mentioned, for garbage, alluding to undesirable or ineffective expenditure. Undesirable or ineffective expenditure. Such waste cannot become nourishing in another context, as for instance the excrements that fertilize the soil. Because what is waste from the standpoint of one system or one organism is actually nourishment from the standpoint of another system. And of course, with excrements and the fertilization of the soil, this works beautifully, but unwasting waste refuses to be a nourishment for another system or another context. It overrides the values of parsimony, of adeptness in productively deploying resources, of profiting even from what might be discarded. Exempt from every kind of system which may redeploy it, the pure, unwasting waste is set apart, absolved from all ties and significance, cut off from the rest, in a word, consecrated, rendered sacred in its total uselessness, right? So this kind of reutilization of unwasting waste is not only something that fills the world to the brim and beyond, suffocating life itself, but from the standpoint of what has been understood as the sacred in various traditions, it sacralizes it. It separates, cuts it off, especially in transcendent traditions of the divine or of theology. Unwasting waste becomes sacralized, becomes sacred. The lowest and the highest meet and touch one another on these groundless grounds. Now I want to move further into the subject matter of the talk, which is how this unwasting waste affects all classical elements, not only the soil or the earth and water, but also the air and fire. Transposed onto the elements of the earth, water, air, and fire, all pervasive waste lends them their historical character and extinguishes the differences among them. We have words at our disposal, at least in the English language, for exactly half of these elemental transformations, notably wasteland and wastewater or wastewaters, still leaving air and fire outside the picture. So if you just glance at the Oxford English Dictionary, you will see that wasteland ranges in its meanings from a desert, a barren plot, or uncultivated land. Thus, land that, while full of exuberant vegetation, is deemed useless. Right? This is still current in the English language. Wasteland can be a desert, land that is completely barren, but also land that is filled with, brimming with vegetation, but not cultivated. This is also wasteland. So just to cite exactly the words of OED, it defines wasteland as land in its natural, uncultivated state. Land, especially that which is surrounded by developed land, not used or unfit for cultivation or building, and allowed to run wild. These are the OED, Oxford English Language Dictionary definitions of wasteland. So it ranges from a devastated area unfit for habitation to really very vibrant, exuberant land that is not cultivated. Prior to the enclosure of the commons in England, common land was known precisely as waste. So common land that was really feeding, nourishing landless peasants and people who lived close to those commons was called waste, or sometimes common waste. This was the term in the English language, common waste, the land of marginal value to which the landless poor had access, right? And so across a broad semantic range, wasteland conveys that land is waste, that it has been wasted, or that it has been from the very beginning just waste, unusable before or after any human endeavors and assignments of purpose to it, and especially official assignments of purpose, because if it is used in this kind of informal way by the landless poor, it is still defined as wasteland, as waste. These significations, in effect, erase differences between the modalities of time itself, the past and the future, the before and the after, causes and effects. And of course, in the context of wasteland, I could not resist the temptation to think together with T.S. Eliot and the really sublime poem, The Wasteland, where Eliot focuses on the redemptive potential of the dead landscapes he describes, starting with the famous opening lines of the poem. I will cite very briefly, but I'm sure that many of you know these lines. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Unquote. So the cruelty of April is at the same time its mercifulness, the material image of resurrection it yields in the recommencement of earthly and vegetal metabolisms where no hope seems to reside. There is a significant gap between pure and impure waste in Eliot's text itself, between what to us seems to be no more than devastation without the chance of a transformation, and what in itself breathes with the promise of reigniting life. And I again quote from Eliot, "What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images." You know only a heap of broken images. Nothing is wasted in Eliot's wasteland unless contingent circumstances break the cycle of rebirth, the very circumstances that are breaking the cycle nowadays in the age that I call the global dump. And again, Eliot here. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year, or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Unquote. The gap between pure and impure waste, upon which Eliot chances in his poem, is not entirely perspectival. It is internal to the dynamics of waste visited upon the earth and upon all the other elements. In an interminable back and forth, waste supplants emptiness with fullness and fullness with emptiness. When it comes to waste, we can really no longer differentiate between these two states of being, of existence, the full and the empty, beyond the proverbial expression, the glass half full, the glass half empty. For instance, another word for dump is landfill, implying that the filling of this piece of land with garbage fulfills it. So wasteland is land that is brimming with vegetation but uncultivated. A landfill fulfills the land when it's filled with garbage, right? It implies that the land was empty and purposeless before this filling and fulfilling with our detritus, that its desolation before and after the filling is, however, there to stay. Waste renders whatever it fills or whatever it lays to, in keeping with the indications which we may glean from the relevant idiomatic expressions in English, vast. So waste makes the world vast, from the Latin vastus, empty or desolate, as well as ample, dilated, spacious, and immeasurable. So in unwasting waste, waste comes into its own. It really renders the world vast, uninhabitable in this vastness, and devastates it. Devastation comes from the same root. It is indeed impossible to decide whether its dilations crack open the interval for existence, or whether its sweeping power desolates and precludes the possibility of the future, the possibility of possibility itself. Plastic wasteland, for instance, becomes the new commons, both within and outside the corporeity of all organic beings. So without an exaggeration, we could say that the new commons are being created without us knowing it as the plastic and micro and nanoplastic that suffuses all elements, suffuses the earth and water and all the tissues of organic beings, be they plants or humans or other animals. It resists this kind of new commons, resists enclosure, reverting back to the old English common waste designation for land that is not subject to the regime of private property. From the depths of the desolation into which it hurls the world, this other wasteland prepares the possible grounds for another solidarity, the solidarity of beings and elements suffused with plastic, for instance. Now, while alluding to the Buddha's fire sermon in the eponymous section of the poem, T.S. Eliot turns to water, notably to wastewater comprehended in a broader sense than sewage. Paradoxically, he bemoans the absence of garbage in the Thames, taken as a sign for the absence of life, both human and semi-divine. So just think about it. He's thinking about the Thames, the river, and bemoans the absence of garbage in it because it presumes that there is no more life. And so I quote the relevant lines here. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city, directors departed, have left no addresses. Right? So this absence of evidence for a party that left all of this garbage floating on the river is bemoaned as this departure of the nymphs and of exuberant life. Pieces of floats, and many of them non-decomposable, testify to the dilation of the sphere of habitation, its spaciousness and ampleness. Without them, without the waste that they are bespeaking in the vastness of existence, everyone will have departed, the nymphs and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors. The heat of summer nights flickers here with the burning passion of life in its affective, sensory, ideational, and other engagements, and it is the gradual fading away of this passion that is the main subject of the Buddha's original fire sermon, because this is all a kind of take on the fire sermon that we find in Buddhism. The point, however, is that waste is both devastating and vast, burning and cooling, amplifying and narrowing down, taking away from and giving room to the continuation of life. The clearing of wastewater, waters becoming just water and no longer bearing the evidence of exuberant life, expressed through these traces that Eliot lists, is no guarantee of a happy end. Elimination of waste is by the same stroke the elimination of existence that ebbs away, departs, leaving not a new address where it could be tracked down. Now, in the fire sermon section of the wasteland, we find a description of the insinuation of waste into other elements, in addition to the earth and water. Wasteland, wastewater, waste fire, waste air. Perhaps more so than the earth, water, and air, fire is always waste fire. Fire always lays waste to the things it consumes, devastating, emptying them of their material forms, reducing to ash. Fire devours whatever it burns, feeding off combustible bodies and oxygen. In the idealist tradition, fire itself renders existence ideal within material reality by turning matter into next to nothing. Right? So fire is always a wasting away of matter and material forms, reducing them next to nothing, making matter as ideal as possible, as non-existent as possible. Following the train of materialist thought, the rests of fiery devastation tend to nourish future growth. The earth is fertilized with the ashes of the past, and elemental metabolisms run their course. The metabolism of the dead who nourish the living belongs to this conceptual constellation that triggers, in fact, Eliot's disgust. But fire also mutates in the age of being wasted, of being produced as pure, unwasting waste. The most pertinent lines of the wasteland in this respect are the following, I quote, "I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light, the silence." Unquote. Waste fire does not leave fertilizing ashes behind when it sets toxic substance ablaze, or when it burns without burning out in spent nuclear fuel rods. Neither living nor dead, silent and unknowing, is not only the subject, the eye facing this fire, but also waste fire itself. Waste fire itself is this neither living nor dead force. The dead no longer nourish the living because, thanks to waste fire, they are undead. which doesn't mean necessarily alive, of course, also. Deserting its function of a catalyst and a conveyor between distinct realms and worlds, it leaves the planet full of stuff and clogs all metabolic circuits, from the minutest to the massively scaled. As a result, waste fire has little in common with what remains of the fires of passion, of interests, affects, and involvements after the quelling of desire in Buddhism, for instance, and in certain ancient texts of the Indian tradition, such as the Bhagavad Gita. The gradual extinguishing of these fires, the fires of passion, of interest, of affect, yields the receptive vacancy of being, right? The receptive vacancy of being that is vast in the sense of receiving and embracing and nourishing existence of this dilated interval, somewhat akin to the Platonic chora, as opposed to the devastated overfullness, the desolate and frozen dump that the world is in the process of becoming, as we have mentioned. Right? So the basic rhythm of desire is actually palpable in waste and as waste, over and above the various fires that ancient and modern traditions associate with it. The rhythm is that of emptiness and fullness, of emptying and filling and emptying again, except that the two moments nearly coincide with one another in and as unwasting waste. So what we are losing now, what we have perhaps lost, is this rhythmicality of existence, defined even in waste and by waste, the waste that nourishes, that is metabolized and becomes food for future growth and life. This sort of rhythm of emptying and filling, the metabolic rhythm, is lost to the extent that the two moments actually nearly coincide with one another and become indistinguishable. When it is devastatingly vast, waste is unbearably full. It fills the world and the elements themselves with the indigestible remains, hence wasteland as a landfill. And it is absolutely empty, void of a future, of transformative processes, and more fundamentally of material forms. The empty collapses into the full in unwasting waste, recalling the rhythms of desire and bringing them to a halt. Right? So it is very often we talk about this kind of deconstruction or surpassing of binary oppositions, such as the empty and the full. But the point is, it is not just any way of surpassing these binaries that is desirable. There can be certain ways of deconstructing the binaries, such as those done by the global dump itself, by the unwasting waste, that can be quite detrimental to life itself, to the very possibility of the future. The waste that stimulates another growth still articulates emptiness and fullness by distributing its senses among different systems or domains, by converting emptiness into the dilation of an interval that welcomes future existence and its ampleness into nourishment. Right? The articulation of the catabolic and anabolic phases of metabolism is more than physical or physiological. It is also logical, pertaining to logos before its abstraction and formalization. The logos, that is the capacity and the actuality of putting things together and drawing them apart, of what we call synthesizing and analyzing, a precondition for speaking and seeing. Waste is the underside of logos and its desire, at times world renewing, at other times suffocating the very worldhood of the world. Everything pivots largely, then, on the question of whether or not it is amenable to being metabolized. And now I reach the concluding portion of my talk on this possibility of relating to waste otherwise, and maybe jump-starting, restarting these halted metabolic movements that the unwasted or unwasting waste signals. I could not speak, Eliot says or writes. The first thing that unwasting waste devastates is speech, the capacity to make sense, to articulate, to catabolize by the powers of understanding, to anabolize by expressing. Right? So of course, I'm also aware that there has been a long-standing criticism of logic and logos, the entire tradition of phallogocentrism, as Derrida, for instance, called it, with all of its Eurocentric components as well. And this criticism is very well taken, but I think that there is something earlier, something somehow infrastructural before we can relate to logos in this totalizing sense that has been criticized. Logos is just this capacity to make sense, to articulate, never absolutely, with the need to always dis and re-articulate oneself and the world in order to re-articulate again. So if logos is to work, if it is to live, and for the ancients, logos is a living being. It is a zoon for Aristotle. It is a big kind of animal, logos or discourse. If it is to live, it needs to be able to metabolize and to be metabolized, right? And so this is what we're losing now. This is what I think stands behind this confession by Eliot when he says, I could not speak. With everything that this performative contradiction implies, saying that one cannot speak, right? Behind the cloud of debris it generates, we may not notice the difference, itself vast, between the language of waste and the techno-managerial framework of thinking that silently circumscribes its reception. Both sides, the ampleness, the dilation, the strange impersonal hospitality to the future, and the devastating vastness, both of these sides recede from view due to the discursive onslaught that foregrounds economy, that really brings to the fore the purely economic sense of waste as the underside of a desirable productive process. Waste as inefficient and counterproductive to be reduced, economized, rendered ideally non-apparent or made to disappear altogether. This, of course, is completely impossible given everything that we know about living systems and the waste that is produced simply from the process of nutrition, of receiving nutrients, the waste that, again, for a living organism is a waste that can be toxic, can be actually a little bit threatening, but that can be nourishing for another system, such as the soil itself, which is renewed through it. In response to these rarely noted historical developments that are actually behind the logic of recycling as well, for instance, before doing anything else, it is necessary to hear waste, to really listen to the word and the thing, waste, discerning its multiple senses and non-senses, effects and futures. I would say that Freud, in his psychoanalysis, Freud did so, for instance, in the preface that he wrote to the German translation of John Gregory Bork's 1891 book, Scatological Rights of All Nations. So it was really a book on the anthropology of dealing with excrements in different cultures, the scatological rights of all nations, and Freud was invited to write a preface to this book on the occasion of its German translation. Now, Freud's micro-intervention reframes the entire scheme of psychoanalysis in an Aristotelian vein when, with regard to the soil and everything soiled or excremental, Freud cites Goethe's Faust on the trace of the earth, Erdenrest in German, persisting in us. The trace of the earth persists in us humans, of which, Freud says, the sexual and excretory functions remain a nucleus. So Freud is ecstatic about this book, not only because he thinks that this anthropological investigation is worthwhile in its own terms, but because he identifies the very nucleus or core of psychoanalysis with waste, with excremental waste. And, of course, sexuality. So this trace of the earth in the human gathers sexuality and everything excremental in us. Of course, psychoanalysis will have dealt with nothing other than Erdenrest, than this trace of the earth, the metabolic trace in the human, as the human. Besides the earth, This trace is, of course, vegetal, insofar as it alludes to the already mentioned nutritive and reproductive functions of plant soul in Aristotle, or to threptikon. It is the immemorial trace that receives all other memory traces in the unconscious. The psyche of psychoanalysis is Erdenrest, is this trace of the earth, the soil, and the soiled in the human. So psychoanalysis is never content with dealing or producing a squeaky clean notion or version of the human. When it delves into the unconscious, it discovers precisely everything soiled and the soil itself. The soil literally and the soil for the growth of psychic life of human beings, including what we call the conscious psychic life itself. Nonetheless, the translation of the German Rest as trace is too nice, all too clean, aseptic, idealized. It hides more than it reveals the residue, the leftovers, the remnants, the disgusting and irresistibly attractive at the same time, disgusting and irresistibly attractive vestiges of the earth in the human. In other words, waste. Aristotle thought that undigested or semi-digested food in our stomachs and intestines was like soil for plants that are rooted in this dirt, while human beings incorporate and keep it within themselves until the moment of excretion. So for Aristotle, plants grew with their roots in the dirt that nourished them, and we humans have this dirt within ourselves, and we're nourished from within and not from around. So there's a kind of inverted version of nourishment and existence, but the soil never goes away. It's as if we have the soil within us, right? This is true for mental faculties as well. It's not only corporeal image. The nucleus-like central position of earthly waste, of the sexual and excretory vestiges in psychic life, is the scandalous axiom of psychoanalysis. And Freud probably intended, or maybe unintended variation, on the old Vedic theme from one of the Upanishads that equally scandalously proclaims that in the middle of the self, in the middle of the Atman, is shit, right? But since Freud borrows the expression from Goethe, it might be advisable in the very closing remarks I want to make before opening up to comments and questions, to take a closer look at the context in which this quotation crops up. So we're talking about the very last scene of Goethe's Faust, which is titled The More Perfect Angels. And it is the more perfect angels who voice the standard Gnostic theme of purification, that in its maximalist thrust implies cleansing spirit of all admixtures with matter. This is what purification ultimately means as an idealist theme. It is to cleanse, to separate spirit from matter, and to do away with everything that is material as waste, as garbage, as everything that is soiled. The persistent remnants of the earth derail this endeavor. So Goethe, through these more perfect angels, voices his opposition to this dream of doing away with matter. And so I quote very briefly this part of Goethe's poem, The More Perfect Angels. A remnant of the earth remains for us. To bear it is painful. Even if it were made of asbestos, it is not clean. If a strong spiritual power gathered the elements in itself, no angel could separate them. And so the more perfect angels are not entirely perfect. They cannot make waste disappear. They are unable to do away with the filthy, earthy matter that even they must bear. In fact, through their attempts to eliminate it, they cause its unfathomable proliferation. Just think about all the cleaning agents for houses, chemicals, and so on, that in doing away with bacteria and so on, release all of this toxicity, a flood of toxicity into the world. So these angels recreate waste in the fictitious image of themselves, unwasting, stabilized, purely present. The pain of bearing it is the pain of those who pretend they are perfect, ethereal, free of bodily constraints, but are not. And moreover, those who, unbeknownst to themselves, organize their lives around the nucleus of the sexualized and excretory remnants of the earth within our core. Spiritual and material metabolisms break down, especially when the spirit-matter metabolism is disrupted. Transitions between gathering and separation, anabolism and catabolism are stalled, as in the last lines of the angel's speech, where unwasting waste makes its sublime appearance. If a strong spiritual power gathered the elements in itself, no angel could separate them. Enough said? Have we not yet recognized ourselves in the portrait of these angels, more than in the Erdenrest, in the trace of the earth they acknowledge as unsurpassable? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. That was fantastic and so insightful. And of course, now we get to my favorite part where I get to ask you questions, because your talk has definitely raised many questions that I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on. So I'll just jump right into it with my first question. So in your talk now, you quoted that the trace of the earth persists in us. And you, of course, speak about toxicity in the environment, defined by terms such as the hydrodump and the aerodump, coined by yourself. And we know that toxicity of the body is constituted by toxicity of the environment. So in the chapter Toxicity in Dump Philosophy, you say, as I undergo traumatic de-individuation, toxicity fleshes itself out. It gives itself a body in my body and a world in every elemental region. And I'm very curious to know what you mean by this.
Yes, thank you, Keisha, for this question. Of course, in the chapter on toxicity in dump philosophy, there is a very specific context in which I try to understand toxicity by contrast with poison. Even though they seem to be completely synonymous, poison seems to be much more specific, and it is intended for someone to be poisoned, not only in the human world of, let's say, court intrigues, which we also find in Hamlet, for instance, reflected, but in the other than human world, when we have poisonous animals, when they release their poison, it is intended for someone who is perceived as a threat, for instance. So there is a very clear intention built into a poison. With toxicity, that intentionality is diffused, so that everyone and everything in the path of toxicity, every organic tissue, becomes a possible recipient and a possible target of this toxic substance. And this is what I mean by de-individuation. If a poison is intended just for me, if a poisonous snake tries to bite me, a toxic substance that is released indifferently and targets me and plants and animals and whether wild or domestic animals in the path of this toxic substance. And I think that in that sense, toxicity and toxic substances work much more along the lines of a dump, where things are undifferentiated and indifferent. These are the two main qualities of the ontological qualities of the dump that I identify in dump philosophy, so that everything is created and decreated as an undifferentiated whole without any possibility for singularization, in a sense. What I tried to do in today's talk is actually to shift the emphasis a little bit to the question of waste and unwasting waste that indeed says the dump a little bit differently in different words, but given the notion of waste and its specificities, its particularly economic character, and the history of its deployment that I alluded to, for instance, in England, we get a slightly different emphasis, not so much on indifference and undifferentiation, but on the stoppage of metabolisms, which I would say indeed is also one of the effects of the ontological dump, the global dump that the world is being converted into. But it can be much more clearly traced and observed through the operations of this unwasting waste, the stoppage of metabolisms at every level of existence, from the organismic to the ecosystemic and to the planetary. Right. Yes.
Thank you. Very, very interesting how everything is sort of, it comes together in this massive, as you say, this global dump. And so don't mind that I constantly reference dump philosophy. I was very intrigued by it. So I'm going to form a bridge of thoughts between your talk this evening and dump philosophy. So again, to reference what you said in your talk, that waste refuses to waste away as its inherent ontology, basically. And again, to draw from the chapter, Globality in Dump Philosophy, you wrote that the dump is not only living us, but living for us. And
Mhm.
my understanding of this is that the body emerges as a site of the dump beyond remediation. And would you say that my interpretation aligns with your meaning of that statement?
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you, Keisha, that the body emerges as the site of the dump. But I would also add that it's not just the body, but the mind as well. So if we are really serious about undoing this Cartesian split between the mind and the body, something that has been done over and over again, but strangely enough, in a way that merely pays lip service to this undoing of the distinction. I think if we're serious about it, then we need to say that whatever is being staged and fleshed out in our bodies is also staged and fleshed out in our minds. And this is my starting point for dump philosophy. If it is completely indisputable that our bodies are laced with toxic substances, with heavy metals, with microplastics, pesticides that we ingest, all kinds of pollution from the air that we inhale, all of this staging and enfleshment of the dump in the body cannot help but be also the staging and the enfleshment of the dump in the mind, not only in the collective mind that we all share, but even in our individual minds. So it's almost a kind of tragicomic situation of if we are thinking through the dump, it's the dump in us that is also thinking through the dump. One of the points of my work is that it is pointless to seek some sort of a way of escape into a still untouched space of purity, either within ourselves or outside, somewhere on this planet that is unaffected by the effects of the dump. This is no longer possible. And so my bet is that we should all individually and collectively fully assume the severity of the predicament and start working through the dump within ourselves, physiologically, psychically, but also outside of ourselves, and try to come up with the strategies of undumping while assuming that we're doing so from within the dump itself, not from at a safe distance from it, from the outside. And so a lot of my more recent work has been moving in this direction of really imagining, envisioning these different strategies of undumping, while still accepting, and every day more so, the overwhelming reach and extent and existence of the dump in every sphere of existence. That is why I insist that the dump for me is an ontological term. So it's the name for being itself, not as some sort of an abstraction, but as something that exceeds different regions of being. It is no longer the region, the physical region, realm of being, or the psychic realm. It is no longer only ecosystems or the elements, but all of being. All of these regions taken together as the totality of being itself is now suffused and defined and infleshed by the dump. So my answer to your question would be that double answer, not yes, the body, but not only the body, but the mind body taken together, and in fact the entirety of being, all regions of existence that where dump infleshes itself at that ontological level.
Yes, I do agree, and I actually do recall you combined the psychological and the psychic effects of the dump along with the body, and I think it very much emphasizes the return actually to indigenous emphasis on embodiment and psychosomatics as mind and body being connected inherently. So my last question, for the sake of time, unfortunately, against reference to your talk, you said that waste renders the world vast and devastates it. And we know that in dumb philosophy, you collaborate with artist Anais Tunder, and in the same publication, you incorporate your own poetry, such as the poetic appendix, elemental, immense, and to root this within the context and the work of VIAD and the BADA research stream, BioArt and Design Africa, what would you say is the importance of art and aesthetics, particularly in comprehending not only the global dump, but unwasting waste?
Yes, this is, of course, a vast question in its own right. I first want to start by acknowledging that the background for our emergence or appearance here is one of the photographs by Anaïs Tondeur from dump philosophy, a photograph that incorporates the actual traces of the aerodump from the place where I was composing the work, so that the image was printed with carbon black particles with which the atmosphere itself was suffused. So you have here a portrait of the sky, which is materially produced, at least in part, with the very elemental traces of the dump that suffused the atmosphere there. I think that the role of art is it is as important as that of philosophy. We can have different approaches to the same topic, and probably by putting our efforts together, we can be much more effective in dealing with what is going on. Because, of course, if the dump itself affects every register of existence and every level of being, then it would be, in order to address its effects and to try to transform them from within, it would be important to appeal not only to abstract cogitation, not only to thinking in this more traditional sense, but to the sensorium as well, to the place of aesthetics or aesthesis as traditionally defined, involving all the senses. So, of course, here it's the visual dimension that is being activated, but it would be really interesting and important to think about artworks that relate to the dump as it is instantiated at every single sensory register, at the level of hearing and taste and olfaction. I touch upon this very briefly in one of the chapters in dump philosophy, on how the dump is instantiated, for instance, at the level of our taste buds, of flavors that are being leveled down by the mass-produced industry of highly processed foods that are either too sugary or too salty, or both things at the same time, and where subtler flavors disappear. And this kind of, there's a prevalence of this massive bombardment by one or two stimuli that instantiate the dump in our bodies, not only in the physical dimension of the body, but in the sensory, at the sensory level. And I think that art and philosophy, in their collaboration, can finally approach something like a very sensuous and sensory mode of thinking, a thinking that becomes a fusion of a more abstract cogitation and a more concrete and again sensuous relation to the world. And of course, it is not just a division of roles between art and philosophy, but at least in my collaboration with various artists, definitely with Anaïs Tondeur, but with other artists as well, the desire is for both art and philosophy to participate in this kind of cross-contamination of the sensory and the cognitive, so that philosophy itself becomes a sensuous endeavor as well as a more abstract one, and art leads to a mode of thinking, and obviously sensing is also a kind of thinking. So all of this is an important consideration here.
Fantastic. And that's the end of my questions. And thank you so much for your insights, especially on the role of art, because we know that art is really engaging with historical and contemporary issues of the world right now, that I think art is, how can I put this? It's doing the work on the ground that needs to be done. So now I'm going to move on to questions from the audience, and I can see two questions for you. From the first one being from Gilbert K, asking, could the pronounced discomfort and aversion that people sometimes experience and feel when they learn about human exposure to microplastics in part be described by an unwillingness to acknowledge the human body as a landfill? This is in light of the prevalent and sometimes narrow view of plastic as waste.
Yes, that's a great question, actually, and I would link it to a general and rather unconscious view of ourselves as somehow isolated or insulated from the outside world. So, being in one's own body is understood almost as a mode of containment. The boundaries of the body are thought of as almost on the model of walls and not as living membranes that are breathing, that participate in all kinds of exchanges with the atmosphere. Everything that maintains, obviously, the body alive comes from the outside, be it the air or the nutrients that we ingest. And with that, the outside is necessarily inside the body and constitutes it from the inside. So all of this sounds very intuitive and very obvious, and yet at the unconscious level, we still continue thinking about the bodies as our living bodies, and especially about our minds as these isolated entities that are unaffected by the outside world, or are only affected to the extent that we allow them to be affected by the outside. So I think that the traumatic core of this acknowledgement of becoming our bodies and minds, becoming the sites of dumping and of unwasting waste, is a part of the traumatic acknowledgement that we are always already opened to the outside, that what is outside is always within, and it constitutes us not only at some sort of an abstract or ideal level, but it allows us to live and to continue living, to replenish our lives, again, whether through nourishment or through oxygen or breathable air. So it's the traumatism of realizing that the outside is always within. I think that comes together with this realization of that the human body and mind, again, I continue insisting, is a site of a landfill, as it were.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I also believe that nothing really exists in isolation, and discrete selfhood is absolutely a myth. We can take the body and the skin as this fleshy interface of engagement and encounter. So the next question for you is by Leora. She's asking, well, she's saying, I'm interested in treatments for cancer, such as chemotherapy, its use of toxins, which are extremely harmful to the body, to supposedly cure the body of toxic cells. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. So I do touch upon the subject of cancer in dump philosophy because I think that cancers that are very often stimulated or grow in their incidence based on environmental pollution are very concrete instances of the instantiation of the dump in a living body. Because what they do is they produce cells that are virtually indestructible. So it's if we're talking about waste that refuses to waste away, these are cells that at the end of their lifespan refuse to die and they continue multiplying and proliferating, then producing a tumor. And on top of it, these are cells that can derive from any organ or system in the body, but that ultimately become undifferentiated. So this non-differentiation, the loss of differentiating capacities, and this metastatic sending of cells, cancerous cells, from one part of the body to the other, really replicates on a micro scale the operations of the dump as the indifferent and undifferentiated accumulation of something. So the tumor is really almost a perfect example, but also not only an example, but an extension of the dump into a living body. And curiously enough, in the treatments that Leora is invoking here, the chemotherapy treatments, it is as if medicine is fighting a dump with another dump. So even though these treatments can often save lives, they are quite undifferentiated in their effects, in their toxic effects on the rest of the body. So they again reproduce the dynamics of the dump in fighting the embodied dump that is a cancer. And despite the fact that there have been many medical advances in the field of oncology and treating cancerous growths, this is still mind-bogglingly. This is still the first line of attack on oncological illness, chemotherapy, which I think presents something of a refusal to move to a more differentiated, less toxic approach, and still follows this model of unleashing one dump against another. And the suffering of a human patient who is already suffering from a cancerous illness, but also from the effects of chemotherapy, is really the suffering at the intersection, at the site of a clash between these two dumps that are released into the body.
Thank you. So I don't see any more questions from the chat, but I do see two questions from the Q&A tab. One from Isabel H. So asking a Johannesburg question. The colonial world has long been the site of waste, most notably in the way in which certain categories of people have been declared to be waste. Post-colonial aesthetics have hence long been concerned with how to live creatively in waste. You talked about hearing waste and an aesthetic of sensory perceptions of waste. The post-colony has always been the site for such explorations. I wonder if you could talk about what happens to views of waste once one factors in the post-colonial world.
Yes, I think this is really a crucial observation that, of course, we are talking about very specific historical circumstances in the post-colonial context, in the context of capitalist exploitation and extractivism, obviously, that suffuses especially the former colonial world, but also the entire framework of what it means to be living in an economic system, right? So extractivism is, I would say, in all of its different registers, is the main culprit in the creation of the world dump or the conversion of the world into a dump, because when the valuable kernel is extracted from beings, be it the earth itself, be it human laborers, be it the beings who know something, their knowledge is extracted, then the shells, the actual beings who contain that knowledge, are discarded as waste precisely. So the growth of the dump world is the growth of an extractivist approach that has been especially pronounced in the colonial setting. And so we can then ask, even when I outlined the situation with unwasting waste and waste that actually allows for another future to emerge, what is the waste that is feeding the future composed of? So when certain categories, the questioner is asking, certain categories of people have been declared to be waste, they are reduced to a kind of waste that is actually feeding the capitalist and colonial system, and new colonial system that is reducing them to that category. So it is not just a discarding, but actually becomes a kind of nourishment for the totally destructive and harmful system that is doing all of this. So when we are jump-starting various metabolisms, we have to be also careful about the actual metabolic systems that are doing this. If it's the metabolic system of capitalism and new colonial exploitation, for instance, that would be something to avoid or to really fight against, in a sense. So, yeah.
Thank you. It reminds me of all these different interpretations of the Anthropocene as essentially being not apolitical, but very rooted, of course, in racial capitalism. And now, I believe it is the last question from the Q&A tab from TJ Demos, a professor we hosted in September for the Border Interactions episode, I believe. TJ says, building on the above, as I hope I say this correctly, Matisse scholar I'm going to say Max L. argues in Pollution is Colonialism, 2021, pollution and waste is in essence a continuation of colonial structures. Given Viad's focus on Africa and decolonial ecologies, it seems essential to move beyond Eurocentric theories of waste and link waste to racial capitalism, colonialism, and the slow violence of corporate globalization, conditions that underpin political movements such as environmental justice, including within an African post-colonial project. How might the philosophical account of waste and the notion of unwasting waste translate into a decolonial ecology with relevance to African context?
Yes, thank you for this question. I would probably take issue with at least a part of this assertion already made in the title of the book on pollution is colonialism. Yes, I agree with the part of it, pollution, and not only, first of all, I don't speak about pollution because it still implies the ideal of purity. Pollution is a kind of deviation from the ideal of purity, so I think that we're well beyond pollution. Because there is, and even this ideal of purity itself is to be questioned from any kind of perspective. But yes, extreme pollution or the dump, unwasting waste, is an effect of colonialism in its extractivist, hyper-extractivist tendency. But I don't think that it is a continuation of colonial structures because there is really no chance of limiting in space or in time the effects of this planetary dump that is being created. Of course, we do know that the distribution of unwasting waste around the world is uneven. Some places are much more polluted than others, and those places that are much more polluted are those that have already suffered the effects of colonialism before. But if we look at the planetary scale, we know that not only the air and the soil are suffused with the effects of the dump, but even the cosmic environs of the Earth are filled with cosmic garbage, with all of these satellites and other cosmic junk that keeps orbiting the planet without ever disintegrating or taking a very long time before falling to Earth and burning up in the atmosphere. So there is a kind of cosmic dimension to this that involves the entire planet, that really makes out of the planet not some sort of an abstraction, but really the site of a cosmic dump, I would say. Not to mention the fact that scientists have discovered traces of microplastics in every single ecosystem on Earth. Even in the highest mountains in the Himalayas and the Alps, in the lowest depressions in the oceans, there are these effects of unwasting waste. So in this sense, I think it really moves beyond any mere continuation of colonial structures, because it is a trace definitely of these colonial structures, but moves beyond that and really gives a global scope. Not only ontological, but a global scope to the problem. And the second point I would like to make is that even if we are there are certain elements in thinking that arose in Europe that fights internally against this Eurocentrism. And I think that it is a very nice supplement, or a very, actually an indispensable supplement to those modes of thinking that are African thinking or Latin American thinking, for instance, because what we have in this European thinking moving against Eurocentrism is an immanent critique, an internal undoing of these oppressive metaphysical colonial capitalist structures that we are all fighting against. The reason why I'm citing Freud, for instance, is that I really believe that Freudian psychoanalysis is one of these modes of thinking that arise, even though it arises within Europe, moves against and really undermines from within Eurocentrism in thinking, anthropocentrism, and everything that goes along with it. This was really the gist of my Echo Freud that was mentioned earlier, the book I published this year on the ecological underpinnings of Freudian psychoanalysis. But especially the return to waste and soil as being, and the excremental parts as being in the core of the human, really undoes the European and metaphysical affinity to a certain ideal of purity, and creates bridges, obviously, to modes of thinking outside of Europe. So I would not be, just very briefly, I would not be willing to give up on thinking that arises within Europe, but immanently undoes and undermines Eurocentric metaphysical modes of philosophizing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. These have been such amazing insights, especially given the current times we are living in the midst of climate crisis and ecological decay and racial capitalism that continues to persist alongside Eurocentrism and its approaches to the climate, to the planet. Thank you all once again.